Do standardized tests predict success? And are they racially biased or biased in some other way against Blacks or Hispanics or women or really anyone? I'm considering this question because the University of California system is getting rid not just of the SAT, not just of the ACT, but of all standardized testing. They're going to be looking merely at grades and college essays and recommendations and extracurriculars. Now, when we think about standardized testing, let's remember a few things. Number one, standardized testing was introduced almost a century ago in American higher education precisely to get rid of bias. In other words, in the old system, if you think about it, you had these prep schools and they had relationships with the colleges. So the dean at Yale would call up the admissions, the counselor at Phillips Exeter or Andover or one of the elite prep schools and go, well, who have you got for me this year? And so this buddy-buddy relationship, there was a kind of a nepotistic arrangement between the prep schools and the elite colleges. And there were poor Irish and Italian and Jewish kids who said, hey, listen, we might have gone to some inner city school in Philadelphia or New York, but we're smart. Give us a test. Give us the same test you're going to give to the kid at Andover, and we'll show you that we can do better, and you should admit us based upon a test administered neutrally across the board. So this is the introduction. This is the actual history of the SAT. Now, this kind of testing, standardized testing, is actually pretty common in many sectors of American life. Here's an example, by the way, of some tests that are used. The U.S. Employment Service administers a general aptitude test. The military uses the Armed Services Vocational Battery. There's the law school test, the LSAT, the GMAT for getting into graduate management. There's the graduate record exam. There's the Foreign Service, which administers the Foreign Service entrance exam. There are standardized tests that are used to hire postal clerks, teachers, police sergeants, firefighters, civil service personnel, office managers, architects, emergency dispatchers, air traffic controllers, certified public accountants, and on and on and on. Now, obviously, when you're looking at a test, the first question you have to ask is, does this test actually measure what it seeks to predict? A test is in a difficult business, the business of prediction. So the SAT is going to try to predict, how is this kid, if he were admitted, let's say, to the University of Michigan, how's he going to do there? And it turns out that the SAT is a reasonably good predictor, not of success in life. Sometimes critics will be, well, can't predict your success in life. Well, so success in life depends on a whole bunch of other things. Do you get along with people? Do you, luck, family connections, a whole bunch of other factors. But what the SAT and the ACT, these standardized tests to get into college, are trying to predict is how you're going to fare academically in college or in that particular college. And it turns out it is, well, nothing is a perfect predictor, but it's a better predictor than any other measure. And it's kind of obvious when you think about it. Recommendations are ridiculously subjective. It depends on who you ask. No one's going to ask someone who sort of has a close-up look at all their faults. You're going to find someone who's essentially going to give a sanitized picture of you. So that's not going to be a very good predictor of anything. Extracurriculars are useful because they help to show your all-roundedness, but they're not going to predict how you're going to do academically. Your college essay is merely a predictor of one thing, your ability to write, and that's assuming you wrote your own essay without getting help, without having your uncle show up and go over your essay and rewrite it, and so on. So this is the beauty of a standardized test. It applies uniformly to everyone. High school grades, as I mentioned a moment ago, depend on which school you went to. Very often, high school grades are on a curve. It's relative to the other kids in your class. So for all these reasons, the SAT is the best measure we have. Standardized tests are. So let me turn for a moment to the issue of whether or not these tests are biased. And another way to put it is, before there was a kind of other test biased. Well, I noticed that 7 years ago on the SAT, they used the word regatta or sonata. And the idea is that, well, wait a minute, if you've gone sailing, if you live near the ocean, you know what a regatta is. If you've been exposed to classical music, you know what so the idea here is that the test is measuring some cultural piece of information and not one's sort of, let's say, raw talent or ability to reason. And of course, over 30 years, the people who administer these tests have worked really hard so that in a weird way, culturally, they're now biased against those kinds of terms. And if you look at the SAT, and even when I took the SAT, going back to the late 1970s, it was full of quotations from Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, and it was written heavily to be, you may almost say, culturally biased in favor of blacks. In fact, if like me, you came from India, you might wonder who half these people were, because you didn't have that kind of cultural knowledge that is drummed into young people, as if all of American history was basically a kind of leapfrog from emancipation to Martin Luther King to Rosa Parks, leaving, by the way, almost everything else out. So there have been a whole bunch of studies. In fact, this is one of the most heavily studied topics, which is to say, do tests like the SAT predict not just the academic achievement of white students, but do they also predict at the same rate the achievement of black students, of Hispanic students? Or is it the case that they are better predictors for whites and not so good predictors for other racial groups? Well, it turns out that this body of research points to a single conclusion. The SAT is actually a pretty good predictor of academic success for whites and for Hispanics and for women. The one group that is not as good a predictor is blacks. But guess what? It actually overpredicts black performance. So in other words, what it does is it says that this black kid will do better in college than he or she actually does. I think our conclusion in looking at all this is that the test is really not the problem. The test isn't creating differences of academic ability or academic performance. The test is like a thermometer. It's measuring these differences. It's kind of telling you have a fever. So the test is pointing to other social problems. And of course, in the black community, particularly inner cities, you have problems not just of poverty, you have problems of broken families, of drugs, of interfamilial violence. Those are the issues that cause, I think, black kids not to have the time, the peace, the motivation to do their homework. That reflects into poor performance on the test. So what I'd like to see is an effort focusing on the causes of why people don't do as well on tests, improve their test performance, rather than scapegoating and blaming the thing that is not to blame, namely the standardized test.